Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight, this afternoon. Dr. Paul Cohen is one of America's most distinguished classical saxophonists, having appeared as a soloist with the San Francisco Symphony, the Richmond Symphony, the New Jersey Symphony, and many others. He has published over 100 articles on the history and lost literature of the saxophone in prestigious music journals. His company, To the Four Publishers, publishes repertoire for saxophone ensembles of all sizes. Dr. Cohen frequently presents lectures on the saxophone, illustrating his talks with rare instruments, manuscripts, and archival material from his extensive private collection. Dr. Cohen holds MM and DMA degrees from the Manhattan School of Music. His teachers have included Galan Kral, Joe Allard, and Sigurd Roscher. He is currently on the faculty of the Manhattan School of Music, the Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University, New York University, Columbia University, and the Aaron Copland School of Music at Queens College. So without further ado, everyone give a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Cohen.
Thank you. Thanks. Very excited to be here. I assume that everybody in the audience is a saxophonist? Is that right? Yes? Good? Okay. Well, I thought I'd start out by taking pity on all of us saxophonists. Throughout the years, we have been given so many labels and described so many different things. Either we have been deified. Now, that's the original, by the way. The early ones you see, they were fresco shops to take out the saxophone, but this is the original. Or we have been vilified, as we see a poster from Nazi Germany where the saxophone was the object of the degenerate art music that was banned. Or we have been embraced as part of American culture, as Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post magazine cover from 1929. Or we've been mysticized. Or sometimes just part of good old American culture. But many of us don't really understand where the saxophone came from or what it's about. The saxophone was invented by Adolphe Sax around 1840. He was a Belgian who moved to Paris, and his intent was to make an instrument for the orchestra. Not for the jazz band, not for the marching band, not for the military bands, but for the orchestra. And indeed, when he made his saxophone, he conceived of them as a whole family. Here is his original sax patent of 1846, which shows all of the different sizes he was thinking of. And they start out from sopranino to soprano to alto to tenor to baritone to bass to contrabass. And he spoke at length of what his intent was for making the saxophone. He said, struck by the various inconveniences, I have been searching for a means to amend these by creating an instrument which, by the very character of its voice, approaches the stringed instruments, but which possesses much more power and intensity than these. This instrument is the saxophone. More than any other instrument, the saxophone is susceptible to modify its tone in order to give it the mentioned qualities and to conserve a perfect evenness over its entire range. I made them out of copper and in the shape of a parabolic cone. For embouchure, the saxophone is a mouthpiece with a single reed, the interior of which is expressly bell-shaped and that contracts towards the part which it adapts to the body of the instrument. He's saying that he made an instrument that will have aspects of the string instruments, aspect of the woodwind instruments, aspect of the brass instruments, and with the technical construction of a conical bore and a mouthpiece of a certain shape to give it this orchestral quality. That was what he intended for. Here's a contemporary showing of the saxophone family. All the instruments from sopranino to bass, and this belongs to Sigurd Roscher, the very famous saxophone pioneer who lived in this country for many, many years. We all know what happened from that. The saxophone had its early start in the orchestra. It was featured in an opera by Holivet in the 1840s. More famously, we know a piece by Georges Bizet, the Lalesian Suites from the 1870s. In opera, we have Hamlet by Thomas, and we have Werther by Massenet. And then in the 20th century, we have many pieces, some by Ravel, some by Prokofiev, some by Rachmaninoff, some by Aaron Copland, and it has had a small but distinguished role in the orchestra. It also became part of the military bands in France, and it became very, very popular as a wind band instrument. In this country in the 1870s, through the result of Charles Lefebvre from Europe coming to this country and being in the Gilmore and then the Sousa bands, the saxophone began to become a very popular instrument in the United States, starting from the 1870s. So much so that the Kahn Company from Elkhart, Indiana, began making their own instruments, the first American-made instruments in the early 1890s. And it became somewhat a very, very popular instrument. Jazz didn't arrive on the scene until the 19-teens. We're talking the 1890s. The instrument was so popular that it was used in churches, it was used in community bands, saxophone quartets, vaudeville, some burlesque, the Chautauqua circuit. All these things around the turn of the century became fertile venues for the saxophone to be used. And the saxophone was also an agent of social progress. Because in the 1880s and 90s, we had women become professional saxophone soloists. This is Bessie Mecklem. She and her uncle formed a harp and saxophone duet in New Jersey, and they toured regionally for many years. It was a professional ensemble, women really making it in a profession that most people had just assigned to men. In fact, Bessie was the first saxophonist to record. In 1892, she made 10 cylinder sides at the Edison Studios in West Orange, New Jersey. The first saxophonist to record was a woman. Later on, at the turn of the century, we had women saxophone quartets. These are the Schuster sisters from St. Louis, promoting for the Kahn Company from 1904. And this group toured for quite a while and was one of any number of women who were doing it as a profession in the saxophone in the early part of the century. As the saxophone continued to increase in its popularity, it became more involved in community bands, ragtime music, show music, and then in the late 19-teens, it became a latecomer to this new music called jazz. And then once it began to be identified into jazz in the early 1920s, it became one of the predominant jazz instruments. But again, somewhat of a latecomer to jazz compared to the cornet, compared to the clarinet, compared to the trombone. As I continue with this lecture, this kind of breezy involvement in the saxophone, I want to encourage you to ask any questions you may have about any of these things. There's certainly a lot of information we're talking about. So as we start to see the varied ways that the saxophone is used, we shouldn't be so much pitying the saxophone for being pigeonholed into this or that, but really kind of amazed at how many different venues the saxophone was used at and is still used today. As the saxophone was a new instrument and not encumbered by traditions of centuries as the other wind instruments had, it was not rigid to how the instrument was to be conceived or designed or made or sounded. It was a fertile ground for experimentation and innovation, not unlike the Google culture that I've been fortunate to visit today. So I thought I would show you some of the experiments and some of the innovations that took place. But before then, I'm sorry, I wanted to just play an audio clip. As today, we are always looking for the most advanced, the most technological, innovative, either circuitry or software or gadget that will make things easy to do. I thought I'd play for you a very, very early clip of a saxophonist from 1899 playing on a very, very old saxophone. a state-of-the-art instrument of its time that if we were to see today, we could hardly play a C scale on. It would be so awkward, it would be so tight, it would be so difficult to do. But I wanted to show you what these people could play on these antiquated old instruments. So we're going to be hearing Jean Merman, who was a saxophonist with Sousa Band at the very early part of the 20th century, around 1900, 1890s or so, playing the Carnival of Venice. Can we adjust the volume on here as well? It's so all of a sudden got a little bit softer. Can we make it a little louder? That's perfect. Thanks. Now, that's amazing that someone could play on that instrument. That's the equivalent today of our having a regular workday on dial-up instead of what we are using now with our internet speeds. So it is really fascinating for me to hear somebody play at a virtuoso level on instruments that look to our eyes and ears to be so primitive, yet to them was state-of-the-art manufacturing. And what they could do with it then is really quite remarkable. And that's what the saxophone sounded like at that time. I thought to play for you yet another early clip. This is the earliest commercial saxophone recording that we have. Eugene Coffin was considered the Kenny G of his day. He was a very popular performing artist, so popular in fact that he was one of the guest artists for William McKinley's inauguration, which may explain something about his presidency. We're going to hear him playing what is the earliest recording of a commercial saxophonist, playing something called Sea Flower Polka. And you'll hear his dazzling triple tonguing. As the custom with cylinders of the time, they announce the piece on the cylinder before it plays.
Played by Eugene Coffin for his brother Harry.
And his brother Harry. Thank you, Eugene Coffin. Now we come back to the innovations of the saxophone. In the post-World War I economic and social euphoria, in the roaring 20s, there were no holds barred. As people were feeling an economic prosperity, it was unrivaled, and they were searching out more and more, and technology was becoming more and more prevalent. There was a wholesale change in lifestyle and entertainment and expectations. The saxophone was right in the middle of this, as vaudeville and other entertainment venues were becoming more and more popular and were reaching more and more people. There was an attempt to try to find more and more ways to reach a very hungry population for newness and for novelty. One of the more interesting ones was the slide saxophone, made by Rifle and Husted in Chicago in 1926. This is what you would think it is. It's a slide saxophone. This, of course, comes from my collection, and I'll show you a little clip as to what it sounds like. The practicality of the instrument was such that they didn't make many of them. It became instantly rare, a wonderful collectible, and an interesting example of how innovations didn't always make it to market, something that I understand is also part of the Google culture. So we can celebrate this some 100 years ago. Some innovations, though, worked very well. In 1929, the Kahn Company, out of nowhere, came with the amazing Carnifex. This is an extraordinary saxophone that's pitched not in the key of E flat like an alto, but the key of F like an English horn. And with its novel shape, and with an extended key range from low A to high G instead of the typical low B flat to high F, it produced a visual novelty and a tonal novelty that is capturing and enchanting. And I'm going to play for you a little excerpt of what the Carnifex sounds like. This is me in a performance with organ some years ago. The amazing and haunting Contra Bass. Yes?
So
sound. It sounds like
Thank
a
you.
mellow English word.
Thank you. Leave me your card when you leave.
Does it have like an English word bell? I can't tell from the picture.
Oh, look on that side.
Oh, there. Oh, it does look like
Yeah, it has a bulb at the bottom.
it.
And we think that that adds to the acoustical nature of it to give it that little haunting, darker woodish quality of an English one. Sad tale of the Carnifex. It was made in 1929, right when the Depression was coming, and right when there was a sea change in the whole economic and social aspect of America. Kahn made a brilliant instrument, but they miscalculated in marketing a little bit. They put it in the key of F, not E flat, which guaranteed that there was no music written for it. They priced it as expensive as a regular saxophone, so you had to pay a considerable amount of money to be able to buy one. They advertised it as a vaudevillian instrument. They showed people of it dancing like this and having around there, and they said you have to have this novelty instrument for your act. Well, there were no more acts. Vaudeville was in steep decline. Entertainment was changing with the advent of talkies. We call them sound movies these days, and more extensive radio, highways, and records now that were more than the wax cylinders and more than just the acoustic 78s. Everything was changing about what we were hearing and what we expected from music, not to mention the ascendancy of jazz. So they made a great instrument, marketed it poorly, made it expensive, made it impractical because of the key, and put it out on the market. They advertised it for 6 months. And then we lose sight of it. We would find it buried in catalogs for another 10 years. As such, we know of only perhaps 25 of these to still exist. And you heard one of them from my collection. So again, remarkably innovative and boldly produced instruments, but did not have the effect that it wanted to. As opposed to Billy True. Billy True was a musician in the 1920s who was a regular roving musician. He later went back to work at the company that his father worked in, the Wheeling Steel Factory, a giant complex on the Monongahela River in West Virginia. But he kept up his saxophone interests in a very different way. Billy True found a way to play 3 saxophones at once. He did that by modifying 3 saxophones from the Kahn company. 1 alto and 2 altos and 1 C melody. And you can't see it so well on this, but at the bottom here is a platform which you have foot pedals. He's able to manipulate the keys for the middle saxophone with the foot pedals. And with extended key work on one hand and extended key work on the other hand, he could play the full range of all 3 saxophones. Something very practical. And he did this in the 1930s and 40s as a part of a hobby and part of his reaching out professionally. Do you want to know what it sounded like? No? Flash drive.
Sorry, go back up to here.
Okay, we want Billy True. So we're going to go back in time now to the heyday of radio, where there were hobby hours and there were variety shows and there were all kinds of entertainments on the radio. Why radio? They hadn't perfected internet streaming yet. TV was still a novelty that was still being experimented with. So we're going to hear Billy True playing on the radio.
Our next hobbyist is a young fellow who lives in Steubenville, Ohio. His name is Billy True. For the past 2 years, he's been working as a pipe fitter at the Wheeling Steel Company. But now he's come to New York to commercialize the hobby he followed during his spare time. Billy, what is your hobby?
I play saxophone.
Well, thousands of people do that.
I know, Mr. Elman, but I play saxophone.
Saxophone? You mean 2 saxophones at the same time?
No, I play 3 saxophones at the same time.
Uh-oh. Now, wait a minute, Billy. Playing 1 saxophone calls for 2 hands and a mouth. Therefore, playing 3 saxophones at the same time would call for 6 hands and a mouth like Joey Brown.
Well, I think you can vouch for the fact that I have in six hands and I'm not a chosen ground.
No, you're not. Well, then tell us, how do you do it?
I have a way of putting three regular-sized saxophone mouthpieces in a row. Open my mouth wide, take a deep breath, and blow.
Well, that partly takes care of explaining how you blow three saxophones. But Billy, how do you play them?
I play two of the saxophones with my hands, and the third saxophone with my feet.
With your shoes on?
Oh, yes.
Well, Billy, perhaps I'd better stop asking so many questions and let you get out of this predicament by yourself.
Try. I play two of the saxophones by hand. On those two horns, I have added extra keys, making it possible to play each with one hand.
Well, now that's 2 out of 3 and a mighty good average. But playing the third saxophone with shoes on is going to be interesting.
I've worked out a mechanical arrangement of foot pedal, so that with my feet, I can play all the notes.
I see. You blow the saxophone with your mouth and finger the keys with your feet. Well, all right, Billy, let's hear you play. You're going over to the stand on which he has the 3 separate saxophones, just like you'd see them in any orchestra. The one he plays with his feet is in the middle and has wires going all over the place. And if he ever figures out which wire is which, we'll have Harry Salter furnish the backdrop. Well, he signaled that he's ready. Here goes 3 saxophones played at one time by one man.
And thank you, Billy True. So that's the kind of innovation that you don't often see. And I have to tell you, I own these instruments now. The picture is taken from my little museum in my home. The design is amazing, and the craftsmanship in getting this to work is stunning. Not to mention having to develop an embouchure that can accommodate 3 mouthpieces at once. Now that takes training. So there's an uncommon dedication for a very limited and unique usage. I thought I would, as we're talking about C melodies and altos from the 1920s, I thought to show you some instruments that I brought with me that are a little bit different than what you might expect. We all know about the soprano saxophone. And most of us know the soprano saxophone as being the small straight member of the saxophone family. But many of us don't realize that the soprano saxophone was made in different shapes, if not sizes. And beyond the straight one, we have ones that are curved. They look like this. This is a venerable curved soprano from 1925, made by the Busher Company from Elkhart, Indiana. These have a different sound than the commercial straight instruments of our time. And when played with the right mouthpiece, to get more of a classical tone, it can sound like this. And let's see if you can recognize the piece I'm playing. Anybody recognize that? Bolero. And that's an actual saxophone solo that's in Bolero, along with every other orchestral wind instrument. Was written in late 1920s by Ravel. Has become one of the more popular orchestral works. And that was written for the saxophone. And you're hearing it in a curved saxophone with a very classical mouthpiece to give it more of an orchestral quality. A very different sound than we often hear the soprano in the commercial pop and jazz context. But Adolf Sax didn't stop there, because he also made an instrument higher than the soprano, and that would be the sopranino. Most of the time when you see the sopranino, if you ever see the sopranino, and I hope for your sakes that you don't see the sopranino often, but most of the times when you see it, it's a straight instrument. It's a very tiny instrument. But some of us have ones that are curved. And this little pest of an instrument is as cute to look at as it is to play. But I'm also going to play for you an orchestral excerpt that was originally written for the sopranino. But when you hear it today in another instrumentation, you won't hear the sopranino. Let's see if you can identify this piece. Here's a hint. It's also from the 1920s. An orchestral work. Anyone heard of that before? Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Rhapsody in Blue. The famous Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin was originally written for the Paul Whiteman Band, Paul Whiteman's jazz band, as part of an experiment in modern music from the 1924 Aeolian Hall concert. And for that combination of Paul Whiteman's band, he had a Soprano saxophone, and that piece was scored for it. Later on, Freddie Groffet, who was the arranger of the work, who was the one who orchestrated it, made a version for orchestra. And he took out all the colorful jazz instruments and more colorful sounding, less common instruments, and replaced them with oboes and bassoons and other instruments. But originally, and you can now, the original version is being played more and more often, you can actually hear the soprano chirp in with that about 2/3 of the way through. So this is the E-flat sopranino in its cute curved version, as an octave higher than the alto saxophone. And I'm conducting a large saxophone choir on Saturday at Stanford University. If you want to hear these in abundance, gather your courage and come out and hear a whole choir of saxophones playing, including the sopranino all the way down to the contrabass. Well, let's go on. I talk a lot throughout the country about saxophone and its history, but rarely do I have a chance to talk to an audience whose mission is in innovation. So I'm enjoying the opportunity of bringing up aspects of the saxophone's history where there are innovations that were going on 100 years ago, 80 years ago, and we've talked about some of them in the past. I'm very happy to now show you yet another one that failed. Around 1940, the Selmer Company, that had an agent, had a company in the United States, came up with the padless saxophone. This is a saxophone that doesn't have traditional pads that cover the holes, but it has metal discs instead of pads. And instead of having, so these metal discs would then descend on leather gaskets to create the seal. In many ways, this is a very innovative idea because it had certain technical expediencies that could allow us to play more. It didn't really work out that way. And I'm going to show you this by playing a clip. This clip I'm going to play you is unfortunately overlaid with my voice because it was part of a CD that I've done. So in order to best appreciate what happened with this, you're going to have to hear me speaking on the clip as you hear the padless saxophone.
These innovative instruments, called Selmer USAs, do not have pads. In their place are flat and thin metal discs. The tone holes themselves are lined with a leather gasket that provides the seal when the key is closed. In theory, this provides a faster, truer action and eliminates pad wear and regulation. In practice, though, the leather gasket proved problematic. As it dried out, it no longer retained its supple shape and sealing capacity. Unless you replace the leather gaskets regularly, The result was an increasingly leaking instrument whose key noise made it difficult for recording and radio broadcasting, areas that Selmer was promoting as the ideal use for the saxophone.
And so went the pedal saxophone. At the end of World War II, because of the research in the war effort for materials to help with the war effort, this brand new material burst on the scene. I feel like I'm in The Graduate. It was plastic. Plastic was a brand new element, and one innovative Englishman thought to use this new plastic material for a saxophone. And he came out with the remarkable Grafton Plastic Alto. For those of you who know a little bit about saxophone lore, the Grafton Plastic is a very storied one. Beautiful instrument. I remember reading that when it was introduced into New York around 1954, just when color television was starting to be available, one of the freelance artists said, hey, this will be a honey for color TV. And it was also made very famous through Charlie Parker, who played the Grafton in his very famous Massey Hall concert in Toronto, Canada. He agreed to play it, no doubt, because he had pawned his other saxophones and had nothing to play at the time, and he agreed to play the Grafton in Canada. It has a beautiful sound, but never caught on, because it looked too different. The springing system was quite innovative and actually very efficient, but too different for players to really get comfortable with. And unfortunately, when it got damaged, it didn't dent. It shattered. It wasn't the kind of plastic that we know today. This is early plastic. And even though the company had offered a lifetime guarantee, if it shatters, we replace it, it wasn't enough for people to become fully confident with it. And so it did not last very long. It lasted perhaps 4 or 5 years and then faded into saxophone obscurity. So this is the famous and very storied plastic alto. One unusual saxophone that's making a comeback these days is the very large Contra Bass saxophone. And here's a stunning photo in all ways. The Contra Bass saxophone is an octave below the baritone. Yes, question?
How do you hold that? How do you hold that?
With a really great harness, great stature, you have to do your calisthenics. It also comes with a stand, but he's doing it freestyle. But just so you know, the weight is not supported just by the neck. It's supported by the whole body because of the harness with it. And you really can't move quickly with it. And if you tried, you need a spotter to go with it. The contrabass is an octave below the baritone. It was part of Sax's original design, but they were made in limited quantity up to the 1920s. But lately, a brilliant saxophone inventor and designer in Germany, Eppelsheim, started making a contemporary one, and this is one of those. We're going to hear what a contrabass sax sounds like in an original work written for contrabass saxophone and soprano saxophone, the Hymn and Fuguing Tune, number 18 by Henry Cowell. Henry Cowell, who lived a great deal of his life in California. This is a work written in 1964 for Sigurd Washer, and I'm sure I won't get it to work. I'm going to show you a picture of 2 of my students playing it in Queens, and you'll have a chance to hear, not them playing it, the recording you'll hear will be one of my recordings of the piece. I'm playing that soprano saxophone that you heard before, and one of my colleagues is playing the contrabass. Can I get a jog here now? And that is the contrabass saxophone. This concludes the formal part of my lecture, but I thought I'd leave a little time if there are any questions that I could answer for anybody in the audience. Yes?
Those saxophones that they used in the very late 1800s, what were the mouthpieces made out of? We used plastic for one reason,
Most of the mouthpieces at the time were made of wood. And then in the early part of the 20th century, they were made out of bakelite or a kind of plastic. Some of them were made out of aluminum around the early teens, but most of them were made of wood. Sometimes the wood was covered with metal so that they wouldn't warp so much. And the plastic that we used didn't come into being until the 1930s. Yes?
With the piece that was just played, it seems that when the contrabass goes up in the high range, it seems significantly softer.
Mm-hmm. That was a function of the miking for the recording session. And if you were to hear it done in live, you would not hear that disparity. Were there other questions? Yes?
I'm curious on the Conifex, is the timbral difference mainly from the spherical attachment on the bell, or are there other differences?
Oh, no, there are many other differences. The spherical attachment of the bell is just one component of ameliorating or masking the sound. In part, the bell has three open resonance holes, one at either end and one towards the player, not towards the listener. So that way, it deliberately doesn't allow some of the lower resonance to go forward. That helps to darken the sound. But you also have the inherent bore of the instrument itself, and most importantly, the mouthpiece that goes with it, which is designed to have that darker, richer sound. So those three things together help to create the uniqueness of the timbre.
Thank you.
Yes?
For a time I've wondered, what would happen if you were to mostly just cut off the bell of a saxophone? Would it make mainly just the same sound?
It would make the same sound. It would really toy with the intonation, and you'd have to be careful that you don't cut yourself. But the sound would be the same. There would be some other mechanical issues that would get a little bit screwed up because of the linkages, but the sound would be the same. It would just not go as low. Yes?
You talk about innovations through the 50s was the last one. What has happened since then? More changes in sax, or do you feel that it's become more static and there's less experimentation going on?
There have been no fewer innovations in saxophones since then, but they've been more in manufacturing and more in consistency and how the instruments are put together and how a more sophisticated design of the instrument to improve the ergonomics, to improve the intonation. We now have soprano saxophones with detachable necks, which is an innovation that wasn't available. And the detachable necks, the different shapes of the necks, give different timbres to the different comfort levels of playing, as one example. So it's become, unfortunately, prohibitively expensive to be as innovative today as it was back in these times. Although today we still have someone who has made a saxophone with a chromatic fingering system, a unique, remarkably acoustically well-derived way of playing the saxophone. You have to relearn how to play the instrument. Much like Billy True's three saxophones with one player, this has an innovation that is extraordinary, but is unfortunately impractical. And you have with today's modern technique, we have developed one-handed saxophones that have been useful for players who have lost the use of one of their hands. I have some one-handed saxophones from the 1920s, but they're not nearly as innovative or as technically advanced as the ones that are being made today. Some of them combine microelectronics to help with the swinging systems. So there are those kinds of innovations, but they're not as bold or as striking because it's too expensive to try that without a certain market for it. Yes?
There's been a lot of innovation in a lot of instruments these days, but it's not just in the manufacture of the instruments. It's been with cybernetic additions and enhancements like the Max violin. I know that in the wind area, people are tracking the movement of the instrument. They're applying sensors to the keypads for extra effects. Can you speak to that and what's going on with saxophones?
Well, we have a lot of electronic enhancements that go with the saxophones, so that we will have like the MIDI controllers that are saxophones, and there's saxophones in fingering only. They don't bear any native acoustical relationship to it, but yet we play them like a saxophone and we can synthesize sounds and do all kinds of things with it, and that's used on a lot of contemporary music. There are a lot of other enhancements that we are experimenting with the instruments by putting on different weights, different masses to try to change the resonance patterns from the outside. There's a lot of contention as to what the materials of the instrument are made of and what coating it has and how that affects the resonance patterns and how that may go into manufacturing. So there are these kinds of things that are going on. And there's no lack of any acoustical studies as to what's happening with the instrument and how that can be changed either to enhance the traditional view of the saxophone or to propel it into a more contemporary usage. So those are some examples. Yes?
I was just wondering, do some modern players prefer to play on these older saxophones from 60 or 70 or 80 years ago, or is there a general preference that like new instruments are better?
I'm still living, and I guess you call me a modern player, and I play a lot on these instruments. The soprano that you saw me play is one of two main performance sopranos that I use, and you heard it in the recording of the piece we just heard. A lot of it has to do with what we listen for in the tone quality. There are many modern players today who prefer this tone quality and will play the vintage instruments, even though they have significant disadvantages. The ergonomics are not as easy. The intonation is not as easy. And they go out of regulation quite a bit. But yet we put up with them because the newer instruments just don't have that same sound. So you see a very interesting cross-section, a significant but minor percentage of people who gravitate towards this kind of sound for the music they play will play these instruments. And it's still available. And when properly, if not severely regulated, they can be as professionally functional as any other instrument. Yes?
I feel like sometimes life would be easier if there was a C sax. I mean, there is a C saxophone, but we don't see it ever. I don't know. Like, is there like? Do you think that the C saxophone could ever make a comeback, or?
Well, C saxophones were not uncommon in the 1920s. In fact, the C tenor, which you call the C melody, was the most successful, the most sold saxophone of the era. And along with that is the C soprano. They made sopranos in the key of C. I have many of them in my collection. It might make things easier, but then again, we can simply learn to transpose up a step, as I do often. And the issue with the C soprano is that it's a little bit smaller, and they don't play or tune as well as the B flat ones. The C tenor was made as a home instrument. And in a lot of the advertisements that you would see in the 1920s, you would see the family, after dinner, gathered around the piano for their evening's entertainment. Remember, this is before anything was streaming. And in fact, it was before radio was that current and there was no TV. So what we would do after dinner, besides going down to the local apothecary and having a malted or a phosphate, would be to gather on the piano. And you see this picture of the father playing piano and one of the family members looking over his shoulder with a C tenor, like this, playing off the piano part in C, because that was able to do that. So not too long ago, a company came out with a C tenor. Antigua, I think was the name, or Antilla. And unfortunately, they didn't sell very well because, for two reasons. There wasn't that much of an interest. And it seems that every C melody that was made in the 1920s still exists. And they come back to haunt us because they're everywhere. And we have no use for them. And only some of them are really, really well made. So I don't think there's going to be much of a future for the C. But I could probably interest you in a transposing coursework. Yes?
Okay, one more. What would they do with reeds in the early days of saxophones?
What we do today, we curse at them, we berate them, we mash them, we maneuver them, we kick them, we play them, we discard them.
How would they make them? Like, would they mass produce them, or would you have to make them by hand in the early days?
They were mass produced in ways not dissimilar to today, except today we have more sophisticated machinery. But yes, they had to be hand cut, and then but they did have machines that would do a lot of the bulk of the maneuvering, lathes and things of that sort to do that. But today, the ability to make many more reeds at even closer tolerances is very active. But then we have to look at the quality of the cane. If they harvest it too soon, if it grows well, if they don't cure it well enough so that when it comes to us, it's ready to play. So there are a lot of factors coming into it. But in a sense, the procedure from cane stock to reed is not dissimilar today than it was then.
Yep.
Yes? I'm sorry.
What do you think of plastic reeds?
We're Google here, right? So I can get technical. I don't like plastic reeds. However, the synthetic resin reeds that are being made today, which are not plastic per se, but it's not organic material, have a great promise. I actually use them from time to time. They have several advantages and several disadvantages, but in the most current manifestations of those things, mostly promoted by the Leger company, they actually work, and I know a lot of colleagues who use them, and they sound pretty good on them. So they enter the stable of what can work. Yes?
Are composers composing today for orchestral music with saxophones?
Constantly. Yeah, it's become a much more accepted voice in a lot of orchestral works these days, and so you'll hear it more and more and more. Yes?
So we see many innovations that didn't stick. Are there any major innovations that did stick?
Well, yes, in fact. Here's an example of one. This is a modern curved sopranino that was made for me by the Rampone company. And the ability to be able to make an instrument that is professionally functional requires quite a bit of not just artistry, but the technique of manufacturing. As I mentioned earlier, we have the two-neck soprano saxophones, which is an innovation that has only in the last 20 or 30 years come to become standard. We have the innovation of the new Contra Bass saxophone that we saw, and other manufacturing techniques that make the instruments more consistent and just more viable. We have the Soprano saxophone, which is an even smaller version of the sopranino. That is something that could not have been made just because there was no ability to make that some years ago. That's about this big, and is in the key of B flat.
Have there been more recent attempts at making plastic saxophones?
Yes. In Asia, there's a company that has been making a new kind of plastic saxophone. And it's been targeted to the student group, and it's very new, maybe the last 2 years. And some people are encouraged by it. There's no reason why you can't make a plastic saxophone, because the tone quality of the instrument is solely a function of the board dimensions and not of the materials. So you should be able to get a plastic saxophone that if it's internally made according to the design, should sound just fine. Years ago, they once made a blindfold test of a very famous clarinetist playing behind a screen. He played on his R13 buffet clarinet, and he played on a garden hose. And people couldn't hear the difference.
What about the mouthpiece?
Same mouthpiece. Same mouthpiece. Give us a break. It was the same mouthpiece, and of course the garden hose had some holes in it, which were carefully put in. The clarinet is a cylindrical bore. The garden hose is a cylindrical bore, no kinks in this hose. And because you had a very fine player playing it, he was able to play it the same. People could not tell the difference. So that's a very upsetting story that people don't like to tell very much, but that's simply an acoustical reality. So technically, you should be able to make a plastic saxophone. Now, there are other issues about why a plastic saxophone may not work. If you're going to have all the joints and mechanical things made of plastic, that may wear out more than if you have traditional metal and traditional other bearings on that, but that's another issue. Yes?
So I don't know if this applies to saxophones too, but I've tried a metal clarinet before, and that sounds totally different from the wood or plastic ones.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think if he had played like a metal clarinet, it would have sounded the same? Because I feel like that would have not.
I'm sorry to say that the metal clarinet can sound like a regular clarinet. Now, the metal clarinets were designed to be used as marching instruments and to be used as student instruments. So they weren't made with the same care as traditional ones. But if you were to get a metal clarinet, and I've seen some of the metal clarinets, and I've had some of my colleagues play with their professional mouthpieces and their professional tonal imagery on it, they sound pretty good. So, if we close our eyes and numb our fingers and just play what's in front of us, you'd be amazed at how similar those can be. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you all for coming today. It's my pleasure to be here at Google, and I hope you learned something about the saxophone today.